Hey, good afternoon, everyone. It's CJ, waiting for the SchillerInstitute.com to kick off their July 4th declaration of a new Bretton Woods. I want to thank our good friend of Harley Schlanger, also the LaRouche organization, as well as the Schiller Institute for conducting this important discussion in regards to the current financial system and doing the necessary things to reform it. So that's what this is about, and it's kicking off right now.
The unanimous declaration of the 13 United States of America. When in the course of human events, it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another, and to assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and of nature's God entitle them. A decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation.
We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed.
The nation's most impressive Easter demonstration. 75,000 massed before Lincoln Memorial to hear Marian Anderson, colored contralto, make her capital debut at the great Emancipator Shrine. Refusal of the DAR to let her use their hall fanned a countrywide controversy, with this great gathering as the climax. The singer was invited by Secretary of the Interior, Ickes, who attends with Secretary of the Treasury, Morgenthau. Spectators include Supreme Court Justice Black, New York Senator Robert Wagner, and a host of notables. Here to listen to the voice acclaimed by many as the finest in a century.
My country is of thee, sweet land of liberty, who thee we sing. Land of my father's land of thy pilgrim tribe, from every mountain top, let freedom ring.
Marian Anderson, distinguished American contralto, sings the national anthem.
Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hailed out the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous flight for the rampart we watched were so gallantly streaming, unbroken through the melting air, he through to the night, the
Hello, and welcome to you all from all over the world that are joining us for this special International Schiller Institute July 3rd presentation. And we began today's program with the words of the Declaration of Independence of the United States. We followed that with a demonstration of how, when some descendants of the American Revolution attempted to prevent another American descendant from singing in praise of that very independence, the wife of the President of the United States, Eleanor Roosevelt, and other descendants of the American Revolution stood up to allow Marian Anderson to sing. The Lincoln Memorial, on whose steps Marian Anderson sang to 75,000 people instead of in the 3,000-person Constitution Hall, where she had been excluded, is celebrating its 100th anniversary this year. And we're doing something today not in commemoration, but in imitation of the founding of the United States and of Lincoln and of Marian Anderson. Today, Helga Zepp-LaRouche, founder and leader of the Schiller Institute, will present a revolutionary proposal for the immediate reorganization of the international monetary system and to be led by a collaboration among Russia, China, India, and yes, the United States with other nations. Now, this intervention is being done on the eve of the July 4th commemoration of the American Revolution's Declaration of Independence, because the world is now on the eve of either destroying itself or of advancing and even completing the mission that the Declaration of Independence so eloquently proposed. Now, at the moment, the American people, in large part, are either unaware of or are being persuaded to fight against the very revolution now gaining ground in the world today that their founders actually proposed. Today's intervention can help remedy that and do even more, because we seek to enlist people from all over the world, as well as specifically from the United States, in a project which is both American and international at the same time. Now, the proposal to form an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods system seeks to complete the unfinished work begun by many over the past decades, especially that of Helga Zepp-LaRouche's husband, the late economist and statesman Lyndon LaRouche. The work to establish a new, just international economic order after World War II was not only proposed by American figures, particularly, for example, President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. There were others: Prime Minister Nehru of India, President Kwame Nkrumah of Ghana, and President Sukarno of Indonesia, and others who hailed from nations that were not represented at the original 1944 Bretton Woods conference that the Roosevelt administration had organized. But in April of 1955, at the Bandung Conference of Non-Aligned Nations, the spirit of the American Revolution was invoked in order to call for economic justice. Indonesian President Sukarno opened that conference by referencing the American Revolution as, quote, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. He said, the battle against colonialism is a long one. And do you know that today, April 18th, is a very famous anniversary on that battle? On the 18th day of April, 1775, just 180 years ago, Paul Revere rode at midnight through the New England countryside, warning of the approach of British troops and of the opening of the American War of Independence, the first successful anti-colonial war in history. Now, the tasks that were outlined at the Bandung Conference, often seen as at odds with American interests of the 1950s, were in fact no different in content than the mission of the American Revolution, though they were certainly different in form. American revolutionary history should now be rescued from the graveyard of misinterpretation and obscurity to inform us of what we need to do now. It may appear that nations that have been said to be America's worst enemies are not, and that they are actually its potentially great closest future collaborators. As John Kennedy said in his inaugurational speech, resolving the challenges of poverty, famine, disease, and war itself together. So this is what we are here to talk about and is to organize this coincidence of opposites, the same coincidence of opposites that brought the 13 colonies of the United States together, that today's presentations are dedicated. It is now my honor to introduce the founder and head of the Schiller Institute, Helga Zepp-LaRouche. Hello, Helga.
Well, first, let me congratulate you for this glorious day in American history. There is no better day than July 4th to try to revive the memory of what the United States actually was meant to be. To come to this Declaration of Independence, it took several weeks and months of fierce battle and tremendous courage to actually declare the independence from the British Empire and to establish a republic, to declare the Declaration of Independence, which contained sacred principles. And these principles are so lofty that when I tried to find some charter for the Schiller Institute when it was founded in 1984, I decided to adopt the Declaration of Independence, and I made only very few words and maybe one sentence here and there changes to make it applicable for the whole world, for all the countries of the world. Now, it is the present tragedy of the United States that they have moved away from these principles. And actually, they have moved into the exact opposite. The United States right now does not behave like a republic, but like an empire. And that has everything to do with the infamous Wolfowitz doctrine, which Wolfowitz suggested to Cheney for the first time in 1990. And that became actually the Bible of the neocons and neoliberals. There's not much difference between them, to be the basis of an unipolar world, which would be run by the special relationship between Great Britain and the United States. Now, that is a travesty all by itself, because that unipolar world conception, meaning, that the United States adopts the British model of running the world as an empire, is the exact opposite of what the American Revolution was supposed to accomplish. These two countries are now proposing, and with the submission of many others like in the EU, they're proposing to run the world as an unipolar world with a global NATO, globalized NATO, where basically the confrontation with Russia and China is already a guarantee. They're using words like ruining Russia, even decolonizing Russia, cut it into separate states. This was the theme of a congressional committee in the last week, which actually proposed that Russia should be cut into pieces, and naturally then would be much easier to be controlled by such a globalized NATO. This NATO regards Russia as a threat, China as a multiple challenge, and this would mean an effort to contain the rise of China, which I have said many times is an impossibility given the fact that this is a country of 1.4 billion people with a correct economic policy, which happens to be based on the same principles like the American system of economy. The present US policy is completely opposite of that, especially of John Quincy Adams. The US is, according to John Quincy Adams, not supposed to go out and fight foreign devils. He wanted an entente of perfectly sovereign republics. Now, the economic and financial policy is also exactly the opposite of the American system of Alexander Hamilton. The United States right now, with the Wall Street, the Silicon Valley, and in collaboration with the City of London, they are running investment funds like BlackRock and others, which are even worse than the previous neoliberal policy, because this manifests a class of the super rich, of the billionaires. It impoverishes billions of people. internationally, but also inside the United States. Now, that British system is about to detonate. It will collapse in the short term, either through a hyperinflation in all transatlantic countries and other countries who are stupid enough to go in this direction, or it will lead to a chain reaction collapse because of an effort to raise the interest to fight inflation. But not only the financial policy, also the military policy is that of an empire. Admiral Charles Richard from Stratcom, who told the Pentagon that he advises them that nuclear war will be likely. All the different security papers and maneuvers are going in the same direction. Global Lightning, an insane maneuver which took place again this past January, talked about a winnable, protracted nuclear hybrid war going on for weeks. Complete insanity and impossibility. As Ray McGovern states repeatedly, he thinks that the United States is run by something called, he calls Mickey Met, the combination of the military, intelligence, Congress, media, academia, think tank complex. And that is actually, the apparatus which is in the liking of the British Empire. Now, the British never gave up the American colony. They always tried to reconquer it. They first tried to do this militarily, and there was the War of 1812, then the Civil War, in which the Confederacy was openly allied with the British Empire. Then, when that did not succeed, there was the assassination of Lincoln and McKinley, and that was about the change when the British takeover of the United States took place with Teddy Roosevelt and then Woodrow Wilson. The United States joined World War I. Completely wrong and completely devastating. And that joining of World War I on the side of the British has never really fully been undone, even if there were presidents who represented the American tradition in the meantime, like FDR and John F. Kennedy. Now, after World War I, the British really set out to conquer the Americans by saying, we have to convince the American establishment that they adopt the model of the British Empire, and then we can run the world together. This was clearly outlined by H.G. Wells and his Open Conspiracy. It was pushed by William Yandell Elliott, who became the mentor of a whole class of pupils in this tradition: Henry Kissinger, Zbigniew Brzezinski, Samuel Huntington. And, the neocons, when the Soviet Union collapsed in 1990, took this horrible book by Samuel Huntington, The Soldier and the State, as their manual how to conduct foreign wars from there on. Now, the transatlantic establishment, which submits to that idea of running the world as an empire, is really like a club. And when they are talking about a rules-based order, they mean that, the rules are necessary so that they can share the privileges and keep anybody out of this club who does not agree with, the principles of the Russians would call it the golden billion, but it's actually much less in the meantime in terms of numbers of people. In order to fortify that, the United States has erected 1,000 military bases around the world. And actually, this system has become what J.C. Kapoor, the great Indian philosopher, late philosopher, called the armament-protected consumerism, or what George W. Bush called in the Iraq War, we have to defend our lifestyle, meaning, certain privileges for the rich, but the majority of the masses of the people, both in the United States, but also abroad, have to be poor. This has been described very clearly by John Perkins in his book, The Economic Hitman, a book which is not nice to read, but useful because it shows you how the system has functioned. Now, the sad story is that the United States, which was meant with the American Revolution and the Declaration of Independence to be a beacon of hope and a temple of liberty, now has now become, an empire which is feared around the world. Now, I want to read you, I cannot do it as beautifully as Marian Anderson, but I think it's very useful, the Declaration of Independence, or what Lincoln spoke about it in 1858 in Lewistown, Illinois, during his Senate contest with Stephen Douglas. The Declaration of Independence, he said, was formed by the representatives of American liberty from 13 states of the Confederacy, 12 of which were slaveholding communities. We need not discuss the way or the reason of their becoming slaveholding communities. It is sufficient for our purpose that all of them greatly deplored the evil that they had placed a provision in the Constitution which they supposed would gradually remove the disease by cutting off its source. This was the abolition of the slave trade. So general was the conviction, the public determination to abolish the African slave trade, that the provision which I have referred to as being placed in the Constitution declared that it should not be abolished prior to the year 1808. A constitutional provision was necessary to prevent the people, through Congress, from putting a stop to the traffic immediately at the close of the war. Now, if slavery had been a good thing, would the fathers of the Republic have taken a step calculated to diminish its beneficent influences among themselves and snatch the boon wholly from their posterity? Their communities, by their representatives in Old Independence Hall, said to the whole world of men, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness." This was their majestic interpretation of the economy of the universe. This was their lofty and wise and noble understanding of the justice of the Creator to his creatures. Yes, gentlemen, to all his creatures, to the whole great family of men. In their enlightened belief, nothing stamped with these divine image and likeness was sent into the world to be trodden on and degraded and imbruted by its fellows. They grasped not only the whole race of men then living, but they reached forward and seized upon the Father's posterity. They erected a beacon to guide their children and their children's children, and the countless myriads who should inhabit the earth and in other ages. Wise statesmen as they were, they knew the tendency of prosperity to breed tyrants, and so they established these great self-evident truths that when in the distant future some man, some faction, some interest should set up the doctrine that none but rich men or none but white men were entitled to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, their posterity might look up again to the Declaration of Independence and take courage to renew the battle which their fathers began, so that truth and justice and mercy and all the humane and Christian virtues might not be extinguished from the land, so that no man would hereafter dare to limit and circumscribe the great principles on which the Temple of Liberty was being built. Now, my countrymen, if you have been taught doctrines conflicting with the great landmarks of the Declaration of Independence, if you have listened to suggestions which would take away from its grandeur and mutilate the fair symmetry of its proportion, if you have been inclined to believe that all men are not created equal in those inalienable rights enumerated by our Charter of Liberty, let me entreat you to come back. Return to the fountain whose waters spring close by the blood of the revolution. Think nothing of me. Take no thought for the political fate of any man whomsoever, but come back to the truths that are in the Declaration of Independence. You may do anything with me you choose, if you will but heed these sacred principles. You may not defeat me for the Senate, but you may take me and put me to death. While pretending no indifference to earthly honors, I do claim to be actuated in this contest by something higher than the anxiety for office. I charge you to drop every paltry and insignificant thought for any man's success. It is nothing. I'm nothing. Judge Douglas is nothing. But do not destroy that immortal emblem of humanity, the Declaration of Independence. Now, with Lincoln, we should apply these ideas. All men are created, and that applies to all human beings on the planet. That was clearly expressed by Franklin D. Roosevelt's intention, what he wanted Bretton Woods to become, namely to overcome poverty in the formerly colonial countries forever and lift the living standard of all human beings to a worthy life and life longevity. The same idea is also in the draft memorandum of an agreement between the United States and the USSR, which Lyndon LaRouche had written in 1984 in the aftermath of President Reagan declaring the SDI to be the official American policy, which had the same idea, to overcome poverty in the developing countries. In this, he says in the first paragraph, the political foundation for durable peace must be A, the unconditional sovereignty of each and all nations, and B, cooperation among sovereign nation states to the effect of promoting unlimited opportunities to participate in the benefits of technological progress, to the mutual benefit of each and all. The most crucial feature of present implementation of such a policy of durable peace is a profound change in the monetary, economic, and political relations between the dominant powers and those relatively subordinated nations often classed as, quote, developing nations. Unless the inequities lingering in the aftermath of modern colonialism are progressively remedied, there can be no durable peace on this planet. Insofar as the United States and the Soviet Union acknowledge the progress of the productive powers of labor throughout the planet to be in the vital strategic interest of each and both, the two powers are bound to that degree and in that way by a common interest. This is the kernel of the political and economic policies of practice indispensable to the fostering of durable peace between those two powers. So we are now at a point where it is very clear. If the United States returns to the tradition of the Declaration of Independence applied to all people on the planet and join hands with the new emerging New World Economic Order, with the BRICS countries, the Global South, and agrees with all of these countries to establish an international security and development architecture which takes into account the interest of every single country on this planet, then we can get out of this crisis. I have issued, therefore, recently, again, for the seventh time, a call to establish a new Bretton Woods system. The principles are in cohesion with the four laws of Lyndon LaRouche. First, to establish a global Glass-Steagall banking separation, end the derivative and other forms of speculation forever. Then create a national bank in every single country to bring the sovereign power of credit generation back under the control of sovereign governments and parliaments. Then among these national banks, they have to make long-term treaties to issue long-term credit with low interest rate for clearly defined development projects, which then does constitute a credit system, and then jointly go for a crash program and international space cooperation to establish a new economic platform with a much, much higher productivity for all. Now we can overcome this present crisis, and we have to act together because we have a good plan. I want to emphasize one important idea, and that is the pursuit of happiness mentioned in the Declaration of Independence. And I want you to listen to a definition by Friedrich Schiller, which he wrote up in his doctoral dissertation, which was published later with the title Philosophy of Physiognomy. Quote, "An eternal, great and beautiful law of nature has bound perfection to pleasure and displeasure to imperfection. What brings these characteristics closer to man, be it direct or indirect, will delight him. What distances him from it will pain him. What pains him, he will avoid. What delights him, he will strive for. He will seek perfection because imperfection pains him. He will seek it because it alone delights him. The sum of the greatest perfections with the fewest imperfections is the sum of the highest pleasures with the fewest sorrows. This is supreme happiness. Therefore, it is the same if I say man exists to be happy or he exists to be perfect. Only then is he perfect when he is happy. Only then he is happy when he is perfect. However, an equally beautiful, wise law, a corollary of the first, has bound the perfection of the whole with the supreme happiness of the individual. Human beings with fellow human beings, indeed man and animal, so through the bond of universal love. Thus, love, the most beautiful, noblest impulse in the human soul, the great chain of feeling nature, is nothing other than the confusion of my own self with the being of the fellow creatures. And this intermingling is pleasure. Love thus makes the fellow creature delight my delight, his sorrow my sorrow. However, even this suffering is perfection, and therefore must not be without pleasure. Thus, what were otherwise pity is an emotion, is blended from pleasure and pain. Pain, because the fellow creature would suffer. Pleasure, because I share his pain with him, since I love him. Sorrow and pleasure, that I turn this pain from him. And why universal love? Why all the pleasure of universal love? Only out of the ultimate fundamental design, to further the perfection of the fellow creature. And this perfection is overseeing investigation and admiration of the great design of nature. Indeed, all pleasures of the senses, ultimately, of which we shall speak in its place, incline through twists and turns and apparent contradictions, for all that finally back to the same thing. Immutable, this truth itself remains always the same forever and ever. Man is destined for the overseeing, investigation, and admiration of the great design of nature. Now, Wilhelm von Humboldt, who was a close friend of Friedrich Schiller, observed concerning a certain poem Schiller wrote, and more in general his entire philosophy, that Schiller had a deep-grounded conviction of the inner cohesion of laws of that design of nature and the creative powers of man as the only species capable of genius. And that idea was most beautifully expressed in a poem which has a lot to do with America and its discovery. And the title of the poem is called Columbus by Friedrich Schiller. Steer, bold mariner, on, albeit whittling die Reitsee. And the steersman drop idly his hand at the helm. Ever and ever to westward, there must be the coast to be discovered. If it but lie distinct, luminous lie in thy mind. Trust to the God that leads thee, and follow the sea that is silent. Did it not yet exist? Now it would rise from the flood. Nature with genius stands united in league everlasting. What is promised by one, surely the other performs. Thank you.
Thank you, Helga. We're going to have questions, and we are going to make sure that we put up at the bottom of the screen a place for you to ask your questions. We've been asked a few questions already, and we'll be getting to Helga on that. But before we do that, we are going to have our next speaker. Now, those who are familiar with the great crisis that was stated around the elections of 2020, and I'm not talking about the so-called insurrection of January 6th. I'm talking about the actual crisis that happened when the world was confronted by a worldwide pandemic, and where there was a need for the presidency of the United States, in conjunction with many other heads of state, to work together, saw that there was a fail, there was a flaw. We entered a situation in which over 1 million Americans lost their lives, and many millions of people all over the world. In fact, we still don't know. In fact, we're in a situation where we don't know much about the origins of the disease, even the progress of the disease. And we don't also know whether or not the conditions that created that disease are in any sense under control today. In fact, what we do know is that the condition of war and of famine and of the economic policies that are presently prevailing means that if there's not some dramatic change offered in the United States from the entire last 20 years of its policy, there's no possibility that this country certainly will lead any positive change in the world. Diane Sare is an independent candidate for the United States Senate who has recently achieved ballot status in a very, very hard-fought fight. She is running as a candidate against Chuck Schumer, well known to people, particularly in the United States, as a kind of cynosure of evil when it comes to matters foreign and domestic. She's here to talk to us today about her view of not only the Declaration of Independence and the ad hoc committee, but also Diane just led a delegation of people that went down to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, the site of the decisive battle of the American war against the rebellion. She may or may not have insights from that, but what that illustrates is a commitment to a certain kind of correcting of the direction of this country. And that will involve the electoral arena as well as other arenas. So it's my honor to introduce somebody I've been working with for a long time and known for a long time, who's now achieved something that very few people have been able to achieve. Matter of fact, nobody else was honestly able to do that in New York. So Diane, welcome, and go right ahead.
Well, thanks very much, Dennis. And also thank you, Helga, for that beautiful speech, which will help people to get through what I'm about to say to them, I think. My question to Americans, are you the slowly cooked frog? Time to get out of or off the pot. The reason why it is now possible to do the impossible, namely to establish a new order among nations based on the principles of the Treaty of Westphalia, is because we in the so-called Western world have gone at least as mad as we were during the 150 years of bloody religious strife which tore Europe apart until 1648. The situation is so desperate and so bizarre that it is dawning on millions of people that something has to be done, which is not in the normal way of doing things, at least not in the last 70 years or so. Think about what we are seeing. Mass shootings in the United States, in schools and shopping centers, as well as massive numbers of non-mass shootings, record drug overdose deaths, 53 migrants dead in an 18-wheeler truck, each of whom probably paid a fortune to end up like that, in desperation not to end up dead by some other means, at least they hoped. Migrants from Africa and Southwest Asia are being repelled with hoses and tear gas by so-called civilized and democratic nations. These same civilized nations are giving tens of billions of dollars to literal Nazis in Ukraine who are committing hideous war crimes, which are documented and videotaped, but are not being investigated in the West. We have Liz Cheney, the daughter of the notorious Dick Cheney, who loved to torture people and launch forever wars based on lies. She sees no need to distance herself from her father's positions. But she has now become the darling of the so-called Democratic Party for her role in trying to make sure that Donald Trump never runs for president or any office ever again, as opposed to allowing the voters to make that decision, claiming that January 6th, which should be investigated, but not by her kangaroo court, was worse than 9/11, about which I might add, we still don't know the truth, although we are supplying billions of dollars worth of weapons to the Saudis so they can kill millions of children in Yemen through bombing and starvation. Do you not think we've gone mad? In New York City, the New York City Housing Authority needs $40 billion in repairs for apartments, which house, it's disputed, 400,000 to 600,000, so 500,000 people. These are not minor repairs. They include things like dripping sewage water, gas leaks, rat infestations, people not having gas for cooking or heating for months, no ventilation. But rather than pay for this, our genius Congress, with a handful of courageous dissenters, who are also now trying to be drummed out of the Congress, voted to send not the $33 billion requested by Biden to the Nazis in Ukraine, but increased it to $40 billion, the exact amount of money needed by NYCHA. Ukraine, which, and you're probably not surprised to hear a fascist government broke its promise, is now launching missiles into Russian cities, killing civilians inside Russia, something Zelensky promised Biden they would not do if we sent them longer range missiles. And now we're going to send them another $800 million. So before we give up and conclude that it's hopeless and nuclear war is around the corner, which it might be, the truth is that most Americans, and I think probably most people in Western Europe, reject these insane policies. In fact, there's tens of thousands of people in the streets, farmers largely right now, and others, 80,000 people demonstrating against NATO in Brussels. The US military is having a hard time recruiting right now. And as Dennis mentioned earlier, a certain LaRouche-affiliated candidate for US Senate was able to get over 66,000 signatures from New York voters when no other statewide independent candidate was able to do it. The fact that the price of gasoline and food is soaring out of reach for working families is certainly another factor propelling people toward a change. But what will the change be? That's why it's so urgent that Helga has called for the recent conferences of the Schiller Institute. We have a job to put the solution on the table and to make sure that as many people know about it as possible and quickly. But we need more than a thing or a list of do's and don'ts. The people in the nations which have gone mad need to take a step away from the negativity of fear and rage and anxiety, and consider what we must do now. What are the changes which are urgently needed, which will allow an imperiled mankind not only to survive, but to increase and multiply happily and prosperously? The question to be thought through is, what is the nature of man, and how does human activity contribute to the ongoing neg-entropic development of the biosphere? And I would really encourage everyone to review the science panel from June 18th and 19th, the Schiller Institute conference, to get an introduction to the work of the Ukrainian-Russian scientist Vladimir Vernadsky, and the relationship of his work to the breakthroughs made by Lyndon LaRouche. LaRouche used two terms which provide the key to sound economic policy, and which must be the guidepost for our new Bretton Woods system: energy flux density and potential relative population density. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But let me just ask you for a minute to reflect about the development of our planet over a few billion years. We certainly don't know how life began, but we do know that the first life was extremely simple, single-celled creatures, which at some point, somewhere between 2 and 3 billion, or maybe 3.5 billion years ago, suddenly be able to convert light from the sun into oxygen, a process of photosynthesis. This actually was bacteria, specifically cyanobacteria, and perhaps was part of how our atmosphere came to exist on this planet. At any rate, this was long before we had human measuring instruments. We have fossils, there are hypotheses, but at any rate, life began developing first in water, plants, and then self-contained, self-propelling animals. Now, do you suppose, or what do you think uses more energy? A clump of seaweed that's just swaying there in the ocean, or a jellyfish which is pulsating and actually moves itself a bit? What about a clam? What about a fish? Which of them use more energy and more condensed energy to exist? How about the frog that we were talking about earlier, which can stay underwater for some time, but now actually can breathe air and hop around on land outside of the water? What's the caloric intake of a frog per gram or per ounce that it weighs, as opposed to that of a jellyfish? I don't know, but I suspect a frog needs more calories than a jellyfish. And I would like you to consider also that this evolution was not gradual or linear, but happened in leaps. Many of the less self-sufficient life forms went extinct. They couldn't survive certain changes that occurred, or they hit a dead end. And actually about 99% of everything that existed, every species that has existed, has gone extinct. But after these extinctions, more independent forms of life, more sovereign life sprang into existence. Think about mammals. They self-regulate their body temperature. That requires an enormous amount of energy compared to a reptile like a snake, which just gets warm by lying on a rock in the sun, and then in the winter just hides under the rock. But human beings represent a complete leap beyond all of this, but we are a natural part of the development, the neg-entropic, that is the more complex, more energy dense development of our planet, our biosphere, and our universe. Not only are we mammals, but we are the only species which can transform our species at will. And you can think about the leap in our productivity and requirements when somebody discovered how to put wheels on a cart as opposed to just dragging things on the ground. Suddenly, you could move heavier goods to much greater distances, and think about how that would affect the standard of living. Think about the discovery of the use of fire for cooking food, for heat in the winter, and then later for a steam engine. These breakthroughs occurred not because someone arbitrarily spouted an extra arm or a foot, not by some linear Darwinian process of development, but in the domain of the human mind and free will. The mind is an organ which exists nowhere, although it has a mysterious relationship to the brain, which we still have to do a lot of work on. But we're endowed, humankind has been endowed this special characteristic of creativity by the creator of the universe. This approach of transforming man's power over nature is the key, not merely to survival, but to excelling as a species. And I wanted to share also from Lincoln, part of a speech that he gave before he was president of the United States to the Wisconsin State Agricultural Society, where he's talking about farming. He says, again, a great amount of locomotion is spared by thorough cultivation. Take 50 bushels of wheat ready for the harvest, standing upon a single acre, and it can be harvested in any of the known ways with less than half the labor which would be required if it were spread over 5 acres. This would be true if cut by the old hand sickle, true to a greater extent if by the scythe and cradle, and to a still greater extent if by the machines now in use. And later he goes on to talk about whether they're going to have steam-powered machines in the farms. So he's describing an increase in what you call energy flux density, that you would be putting more energy per acre into your acre than you would if everything were spread out over 5 acres, but you're getting a 5-fold increase in the amount of wheat that can be produced. That means you're condensing your production of 50 bushels of wheat into 1 acre from 5. And then the amount of labor, he said, is maybe less than half of what it takes. So you require overall less labor, but more labor per acre, but you get a 5-fold result. So you can think of this another way. If I took a baseball bat to try to cut an apple or smash an apple, and especially if I didn't swing it over my head, but I just pushed it down on the apple, that would require an enormous amount of force. Whereas if I had a very sharp knife, it wouldn't require that much force at all. But the pressure, the energy of that would all be condensed into this little tiny blade. So think about the silly people in Poland and Lithuania who are now going to go back to burning wood as opposed to using fossil fuels, because that's part of the sanctions on Russia and also the refusal of people to build new nuclear power plants. Now, I wanted to go through this because there were 2 really important points, one of which Helga touched on already in LaRouche's 4 laws. The development of fusion power is not a, what's the word? It is not something that's just up to your own opinion or we can do it or not. It is actually a life or death question. For mankind to survive, we have to grow. You cannot reverse this process. You can only increase this process. And that means we have to develop forms of energy that are orders of magnitude more dense and hotter than the kinds of energy we have today. And fusion is the way to go. And there are other forms that come after that. Number 2, which I'm hoping will become more clear to you, is that the whole premise of the environmentalist movement is satanic. It is actually the total reverse of nature, because it demands that we go from higher levels of energy flux density to lower levels of energy. In other words, the exact opposite of the way the entire universe is constructed and the universe develops. And what we are seeing is that by decreasing the amount of energy on this planet per capita and per given land area, closing down nuclear power plants, and then even banning fossil fuels and going to things like windmills and solar panels, which require vast, vast areas of land for no energy and very unreliable energy, will actually lead to a hyperbolic increase in the death rate. So I don't think it's an accident that Prince Charles and his bankers' dictatorship are calling for this. And I think people should reflect why our proposal for a new Bretton Woods is so urgent, why years ago the British Empire said that to reinstate Glass-Steagall, merely that, would be considered an act of war. We are asserting the natural principles of the development of the universe. They are asserting the opposite. So the point of an ad hoc committee for a new Bretton Woods is to lay the basis in human economic policy for mankind to increase the potential relative population density on this planet by increasing energy flux density. It is not to be a series of monetarist agreements which merely alleviate debt or allow poor people to have more money, as if you could measure anything important in terms of money. I would ask everyone to imagine instead where mankind could be 100 years from now. Will the Earth have 30 billion people on it, living in gleaming, new, spotless cities, traveling on trains at 500 miles per hour, with beautiful nature preserves, with pristine lakes and forests that are managed by human beings? The first colony on Mars might have a few thousand settlers by then, and we might have discovered several dozen more inhabitable planets and be on our way to figuring out how to get there. The task before us now, which everyone watching should join and help to do this, is how do we get from here to there? Obviously, war has to become a thing of the past, and mature adults have to be brought into policy making. We will have to liberate our neighbors from all of the brainwashing that's been done against those nations which are actually attempting to move in the direction that I've indicated. The irony is that the worse the situation gets, the more likely it is that people will listen to us. But the question which should impel all of us to move boldly is, will it happen in time? Thank you.
Thank you, Diane. So we are getting a lot of questions, and I want to try to put this together a certain way. But before we go to questions, let me just ask, we have, we have one person that is with us as a respondent. Some people know him well, some people don't. His name is Kirk Wiebe. He is a retired senior analyst from the United States National Security Agency. Kirk has done several things in the cause of peace. I just want to indicate something so people will have some idea of who he is. This is part of a speech he gave actually at the 9/11 memorial on 2021, the Teardrop Memorial in New Jersey with the Russian government present. He said, I and Bill Binney resigned from the National Security Agency on October 30th, 2001, because we were prevented from using means readily available to us prior to 9/11 that would have prevented those terrorist attacks from occurring. We were prevented by corrupt elements of our intelligence community and our government. Trillions of dollars and millions of lives on both sides of the resulting wars have been lost. More importantly, the world has become less safe, not more safe, over the past 20 years. I believe that any talk of potential military confrontation or war with Russia, China, or other nations must now be thoroughly discussed with the American people, as it never is, and by those such as myself in a position to reveal the true way those decisions are made, decisions which are often the opposite of those in the true interests of the United States itself. I think that in light of both what Diane had to say and even differently what Helga had to say about the proposal we're making today, it's very useful that Kirk is here, and Kirk is just going to respond to what he's heard. And then I'll ask Helga if there's anything that you'd like to say in response to him or Diane. So, Kirk?
Yes, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes.
All right. What a wonderful two addresses, one by Helga and the other by Diane. And I say that with all sincerity because we are heading down an absurd path that invites confrontation rather than peace and economic prosperity on the global stage. In your opening remarks, Dennis, you talked about this global NATO, globalized NATO, as the way ahead for international relations. Nothing could be absolutely more absurd than such a concept. To use a military basis, remember, NATO was formed out of the perception that Western Europe was under threat from the Soviet Union and it needed to unite in the face of that threat. The Soviet Union is gone. There has been no effort that I've ever seen that Putin is out to conquer the world, let alone Western Europe. Does Putin have economic interests? Of course, we all do. All nations do. And they should be permitted to participate on an even playing field, not under the control of a couple of nations who desire to manipulate not only economics, but the global financial system and virtually the ways of life around the world. We need to return to best practices for good and productive human relations. Simple concepts that we once treasured have gone. They're no longer practiced. Whatever happened to simple respect for others? Whatever happened to honesty and transparency? Whatever happened to honor and integrity and speaking the truth and meaning it and sticking to it? We have to begin to the change that you're talking about based on Westphalia. We have to begin by looking at beneficial actions, beneficial not to the few, but to the larger family of nations globally. We're in a global world that's going to change. We are dependent on literally relationships on the other side of the planet. We must establish a global free market economic system designed to raise the standards of living of all nations, period. That is a simple goal. We know how to do it. We have the experience. And when I say we, I don't mean the United States. We, in a community sense, know how to do this. We have lots of experience, decades of experience dealing with nations in all kinds of economic status. Use that knowledge. Secondly, establish a strong monetary system that facilitates the operations of national banks that reside and work for the benefit of each country. The system we have today is one of control of the few, by control of the many by the few. And that whole rubric needs to be dissolved and rebuilt so that nations who need credit can get it. Well, I'm not saying give away everything. Give what you can, but regulate and run the operation in an even-handed way, not with the goal of control, but the goal of benefiting where benefit is obviously needed. Remember, we're working to establish independence in nations, not dependence among nations. And that pretty much sums up what I want to say, but I would use one summary statement, and I would say this: dollars and power are driving decisions today. That will not generate global cooperation or global peace, not by any definition, and it never has historically. We must make sure and ensure that motives are driven by principles of human relationship and respect for others. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Kirk. So Helga, if you'd have anything to say in response to him or to Diane, or any other remarks.
Well, I'm very happy to hear from all three of you, because I know that all the people in the rest of the world are looking out for patriots like you, because everybody is wondering, is the confrontation between the United States and Russia and China and some others, is it inevitable? Is there any way, how we can find a dialogue with true patriots? And I think what you three all said is obviously giving hope. I think we are heading towards the perfect storm. I mean, the financial system is desperate. I mean, we are heading towards a situation where people will have no food. I had the opportunity yesterday to hear what a German farmer was saying, and the story he was revealing is absolutely scary. The cartels and the food chains, they are now making already contracts of basic prices, which is 3, 4, 5 times higher than the present food prices. Nobody will be able to afford that. And that is, basically for the next harvest. And, that is not even taking into account the possibility that, when the interest rates are now going up, and Jerome Powell from the Federal Reserve just said, that they will increase the interest rate no matter what. And Bill Dudley, the former head of the Federal Reserve in New York, said that he expects a very hard landing for the US economy. And then he used this very hilarious image of this video, which apparently is very known in the United States, Wile E. Coyote, which is this this comic figure who runs over the cliff and then for a few seconds is running in the air already beyond the cliff and then goes down like a rocket into the earth. And he said that is exactly what will happen with the US economy, and for that matter, the whole financial system. So we better prepare that, a reform, a reorganization has to take place based on the principles Diane and Kirk were touching upon, or, laid out very clearly by my late husband, Lyndon LaRouche. And, this is not a joke. We are heading towards a situation where people will have nothing to eat, no heating, no fuel, and, social chaos can erupt of dimensions which people have not even an inkling of. So I think we better take this proposal for a new Bretton Woods idea very serious, and really start to prepare to bring the system in order. It's literally 1 second before 12.
Okay, Diane, anything?
Well, I just really want to stress this question of the Bretton Woods, because if you don't think about it hard, or you don't look at the dispute going on, which was very intense between the pervert John Maynard Keynes and Harry Dexter White, FDR's, I think, assistant Treasury Secretary or something like that. you miss the point. People, and a lot of people bandy this about, oh, we need a new Bretton Woods, we need a new Bretton Woods. They're not talking about what we are talking about, because what we are talking about is that the credit system, the system of banking, is dictated by the physical necessities of your population and your population growth. That is, we've become inverted. What Kirk said is absolutely correct. People tend to see themselves as appendages of money, as if the money or the debt or the bubble has some actual physical force or existence, and human beings don't. We are the life force of the universe, and we can determine what the economy does. And I think there's a great deal of absurdity that we take for granted, just what people get paid. People now, the average minimum wage absolutely does not even cover rent, food, and health insurance. Now, how can that be? And a lot of the minimum wage jobs are the hardest jobs, where people work hard, or they're very important jobs where you're entrusted with the care of other precious human beings, like home health aides, or people who work in group homes, or people who work in senior centers. But somehow we go about our day as if this is normal, when it costs more to cross the George Washington Bridge than you get paid in minimum wage in an hour. There's something really, really off about that system. So people should not feel threatened about the idea of putting this whole thing through bankruptcy reorganization, and understand that the economy has to be brought to heel to the needs of the population, and it can be regulated. And we do have many people in history, not enough, you can tell by where we are now, but we do have people in history who understood this, particularly people like Alexander Hamilton, Franklin Roosevelt, Lyndon LaRouche, who was the towering genius of this method, and there's no excuse not to do it. And unfortunately, the government has engendered such extraordinary distrust that I know many people feel a lot of anxiety about the idea of putting this through bankruptcy. What about my pension? What about this? Well, as Lyndon LaRouche said, your pension would have to be protected. But are you really more protected by just allowing this bubble to completely explode, like what happened in Weimar, Germany, where we can all be walking around with wheelbarrows full of billions of $1 million notes, and with that we'll be able to afford 1 cup of coffee at a local bakery?
Actually, we have a clip from Lynn from probably 1994, which I think we're going to put in here, which will help to illustrate, Diane, what you were just talking about, but also what the, if you will, revolutionary upheaval nature is of what Lynn actually was proposing would be done with the economy. Now, at this time, this is an excerpt from a questions being asked to him about particular utopian monetary scheme that someone was asking at a conference. Lynn had responded to that, and then he said the following.
Because what we have to do is we have to restructure the labor force, including the unemployed. We have to get large projects in which we essentially let the services sector, except for education, science, healthcare, and other essentials, and a certain amount of allowance for administration, let it collapse. We will never try to rebuild that section of employment again. We will not build yuppie financial office positions. Well, a lot of the so-called gambling, we will never try to find jobs in gambling again. What we will do is, see, we have to get productivity up. If I double the percentile of the total labor force today employed in producing tangible wealth, if I also increase the number of people who are employed as scientists and engineers in useful ways as a service, if I increase the number and training of qualified teachers, if I increase the amount of healthcare investment in terms of service delivered, and if I minimize about everything else, then I will automatically, with no change in technology, double the rate of productivity of the U.S. economy. Simply by doing that, using whatever facilities I can. To do that, we need to create jobs not in the consumer sector. We do not want to increase the employment in the consumer sector, at least not significantly, because that would be counterproductive. What we want to increase is employment in two sectors, apart from science, education, health, etc. What we want to increase is capital goods production and infrastructure, including restoration of ruined land area, which has been garbaged up in the recent period. So therefore, we are going to increase, the great increase in employment will come from the non-consumer paid sector. In the capital goods sector, as in infrastructure, land improvements, as an extension of infrastructure, and in capital goods production. Plus, in services such as education, in the production of hospitals, increasing the attendance at medical schools to get an adequate supply of new physicians and other medical professionals, and in science generally, such as in space programs. All of these things are things which do not tie directly in any way into consumer purchases. So the idea of exchange, like a Robinson Crusoe economy, which I know is widely taught in universities and discussed much, that doesn't work. What works is, in the development of economy, the social division of labor, of the labor force among different categories of employment based on the categories required by technological level. This is key to an economy. And by simply saying we're not going to throw credit out loosely and let the market decide where the credit goes. No. What it means is we're going to stabilize the economy by providing credit where it's needed. And the first objective, and my objective, is to double the number of people who are employed in production of wealth as a percent of the labor force. That automatically will halve the cost of living and double the productivity of the economy. Because what we're doing every time you buy something today, you're not paying for the cost of production. You're paying for the usury. You're paying for all the overhead. You're paying for the $800 billion of drugs, which is coming out of the economy. That's built in as a tax on everything you buy. You're paying for the gambling industry. The $400 billion that's going into gambling is coming out of your pocket in terms of the price of goods. It has to come from someplace. The usury, the derivatives load on, the debt load on is coming out of your pocket. Every bit of real estate speculative profit is coming out of your pocket. It's coming out of the price of everything you buy. So we can double the productivity of the U.S. economy, or more than double it. We can halve the cost of living real quick if we can simply do the right thing in terms of putting the credit in the right places, which produces the right result, which may mean some tax incentives, it may mean other kinds of incentives to the private sector to get these things in action. But the way to do it is start with the public sector and give out the government-related credit contracts to private people who are taking contracts to assist these projects. So we can just use the old money system, but we have to use it in a dirigist way, in which we say, we want this to be the public sector, we want this to be the private sector, we're going to help this, and we're going to help this, and we'll watch it, and get the public more involved consciously in what we're doing, and then it will work.
Now, I know there may be responses to that, but I want to, Helga, give you a question which goes in the same direction. This is from Munasha, and he asks, can the financial institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, etc., defund arms manufacturing? Then he gets a little bit clearer. How can we bring zero about zero arms manufacturing? And then he says, why is it that when you get to investment and funding of wars, that's continually treated as a primary urgency compared to addressing global food security, healthcare, energy, and infrastructure? So, Helga?
I think it's very simple. This military-industrial complex of which President Eisenhower already warned, and it obviously has grown enormously since. They're making an enormous amount of money of these wars. They need the war. I mean, they are opposed to dissolving NATO and they are opposed to have peaceful relations with Russia, China, and other nations, because, you know, then their source of income is gone. I think it would require government and parliaments, the Congress, to make legislations which forces them to be retooled. I mean, all of these look, the United States may still be a very important, powerful economic power, but they don't have a Mittelstand. They don't have the in-depth production chains, which would be a sign of a healthy economy. Because of the outsourcing into cheap labor, Mittelstand does not exist. You have the major military firms, and, you know, that is really the problem, that the wars are basically, you know, generated to keep that class of billionaires and millionaires keeping and enlarging their privileges. So it would require government and strong Congress to make legislation to force them to retool, and that would be eminently possible. You can take any industrial capacity and you call in the design engineers and you say, how long do you need to turn this into productive production, let's say, of a fast train system, of the Sanger project. You know, this is this very fast private plane, which, you know, really would revolutionize air travel. And there are many, many projects. The United States does not have a fast train system. It's ridiculous. The only fast train track is somewhere between New York and Boston, and it goes some ridiculous 100 miles. This is a laughingstock. China by now has more than 30,000 miles of fast train. These trains are poems. I love to go with these trains because they fly through the landscape. They are quiet. You don't hear anything. They don't make sudden motions. You can put a full glass of water on the table and it remains there without losing any water. And it's efficient. It's very good. Why not build a train system in the United States, you know, where you connect all the major cities of the East Coast, the Midwest, the South, the West Coast, with a fast train system? You know, maybe you need 50,000 miles for starters, and you could retool a lot of the military industrial capacity to produce such things. Maglev trains, the Chinese are now testing a maglev train which goes 600 kilometers an hour. Then there are already many experiments about the so-called super loops, which will go 1,000 kilometers per hour. So you have a revolution in mass transport. And, you know, for many parts of the United States, this would be highly profitable. Infrastructure increases, increases in investment, in increases in productivity in infrastructure always benefits the entire economy. And, you know, that is, I mean, look, the condition of the streets. When you go from, you know, when you come from Washington, you go into New Jersey, parallel to New York. These streets are traps. They are dangerous places. And I'm always surprised that people can manage to go over these streets because they're irrational. They have potholes. They're not well organized. All of this needs repair. There are entire parts of the United States cities which, you know, you cannot really repair. You would have to close them down and build another part at a different corner of the city completely new. I mean, you have a massive investment program for the United States. And, you know, if the United States wants to survive, and I really mean it, I mean, this whole talk about China being a systemic rival, it is not China which is the problem. If the United States lets its own children go on pot, have access to the most insane automatic weapons, which resides together with the video games and the violence in the entertainment industry and all of that, you have a collapsing society. All of this are signs of a cultural collapse of a society. And it's not China which is doing it. It is the United States doing it to itself. So I think, you know, it does require parents, teachers, and others who say this has to stop. We have to get our country back. It's not China, it's the United States which is the problem.
Okay. Diane, any thoughts on that particular question?
I was just thinking, does she have to rub it in? It's terrible. Oh, I mean, it really, but you have to, I mean, we really have to look at this with the eyes not of the slowly cooked frog, but any sane person take a step back and see it, and then ask yourself, what on earth has possessed us and caused us to go along with this? And I agree, Helga, this drug problem is actually huge. It got much worse during the pandemic, the isolation, etc. I think that was by design, encouraging it, and now we're going to have pot dispensaries on every corner, and people like Schumer pretend it's decriminalization. Well, no reasonable, sane person wants to see people spending many years in prison for nonviolent offenses. But in fact, people who commit violent offenses are out walking the streets. But this is actually pushing drugs. When you're marketing things that are 99% THC, shaped as gummy bears and things like that, you're pushing drugs on children. And I really do think part of it is like the Brave New World. They're hoping that if people are high or medicated, they might not notice that they're starving to death and they can't put gas in their car.
We have a set of different kinds of questions. I'm going to group a few so that both of you can respond. These are all in the zone of the new Bretton Woods system. There's a question from Chuck. I'm just giving first names on all this. From Chuck. He says, my question is, won't a new Bretton Woods system set up or prop up a unipolar global order? Won't a new Bretton Woods system set up or prop up a unipolar global order? There's a second question, which is actually implicitly been addressed by Lynn, and this one is from Terry, and he asks, would a new Bretton Woods system kill inflation and price rises? Okay, so he's asking about how that would operate. And then the final question is from Sarah, and it is, would it be possible for U.S. corporations to join in the Belt and Road Initiative and the BRICS and just bypass the stagnant U.S. government? So again, would a new Bretton Woods system set up a unipolar global order? Is it going to address the problem of inflation and price rises? Or also, could U.S. corporations just bypass the government and join the Belt and Road? So, Helga, I want to start with you and then go to Diane.
Well, I think it would not lead to an unipolar world because that train has left the station. The unipolar world is dead. And, the idea that it somehow still exists is really fake news. What has happened in the last several weeks, where there were several conferences and meetings, one between the Eurasian Economic Union, they were discussing to set up basically a new economic system with the idea of favoring the physical economy, capital controls, and credit for investment in the real economy. Then you had the BRICS conference, which is now growing. They had a meeting of the BRICS, which is Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And they had invited 14 other major developing countries. They represent already the majority of the world, and they agreed to have a completely different new financial credit system, which is based on sovereignty. It's based on physical economy, and the currency type they are discussing is really very much like what Lyndon LaRouche was saying, a commodity-based currency. That it's related to real value of actual physical goods and not monetary values. And that, is a change which has been introduced by several economists from Russia, from China, who are heavily influenced by Lynn's ideas and who are very familiar with these ideas. So that danger does not exist. The inflation is not a problem because the first step to save the humanity is one has to get rid of that which generates the inflation, that is money creating for money's sake, derivative speculation, all kinds of speculation in food and energy must stop. This is completely immoral, and it's also counterproductive. Obviously, American firms could immediately join projects. Xi Jinping, from the very beginning, has said that the Belt and Road Initiative is an open system. Everybody is welcomed to join it in the same way like, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, the AIIB, was and is open. As a matter of fact, many countries, including the British, are members of it. The United States, I think, is one of the few countries which are not. But also the New Development Bank that's the BRICS Bank, is completely open to new memberships. And as Charles Freeman, the very important American diplomat who was the key translator for Nixon at his first trip to China in 1972, and is very knowledgeable about these matters, he said, let the Chinese build railways, we put an American locomotive on it. Or let the Chinese build an airport, we put our American planes into it and have business too. There is no need to have a zero-sum game mentality. It is possible to cooperate in multi-level investments and joint projects. I mean, that has been the normal behavior of countries until this recent mania erupted, and joint ventures, where each firm or each country brings in whatever their fortitude is. That is the way you do things when you are good. So all of these things are relatively easy to be solved, and it's only when you insist that there is only one narrative that you become completely stupid.
Okay, Diane, you have anything to add to that?
I do, and also it may lead to a question for Kirk, actually, which is, we remember when Mike Pompeo was Secretary of State during the Trump administration, he hauled in the governors basically to threaten them if anyone would work with China. And we had this whole witch hunt where people were branded, and every Chinese American professor and researcher and student was supposed to be a spy. Chuck Schumer explicitly prevented New York City from having modern rail cars built in a Chinese, I guess, owned plant in the United States with an American workforce like they have in Massachusetts and now in Illinois, because he said the Chinese are going to be spying on people in the subway cars. God forbid they might listen in on who was going to win the latest baseball game or whatever people talk about in the subways. I mean, really crazy. So it does, the fact that people could be threatened for this raises the question of the relationship, I think, between the intelligence agencies and this Wall Street military industrial complex. Obviously, these agencies are not just running around trying to overthrow governments and so on, but somewhere there has to be a very intense relationship between the London and Wall Street banking system and the way that these agencies can come after people, organize coups against people. I mean, people may particularly not like former Governor Cuomo. I had certain major disagreements with him, but he was just driven out of office without a trial within a few months of an election when people could have voted him out. We saw the same thing, frankly, with Trump. It was all hysteria. There's no longer innocent until proven guilty or any kind of due process. There seems to be these lynch mobs and an ability of the various intelligence agencies to interface with the news media and Wall Street to dictate what the policy will be.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I have a question which has been posed to all of the speakers, which goes with what you're just referring to, Diane, and it's this from David. Hold on, sorry. Let me go to my phone, maybe easier for me to get it here from here. Yes, is it just a problem of the profiteering of the military industrial complex, or are we not now in a Malthusian framework in which the wealthiest families are determined to reduce the world population to just 1 billion people? Isn't that why war is regarded as better than production for the support of living standards? Helga, let me come to you first, and then we're going to come to Kirk. That's definitely a question for you. And then, of course, Diane, you want a response to your question, I presume, too.
Yes, I would say there is clearly that element as well, because these people have become an oligarchy. You know, an oligarchy thinks that they are a class of privileges and that too many people are of a nuisance. I think one good example is this unspeakable Kurt Schwab, or Klaus Schwab rather, the head of the Davos World Economic Forum. In his book, his latest book, he says the problem is that the inclination of people to overcome poverty is what is the most deadly for the planet. You know, Obama, you know, a couple of years ago, when he was in South Africa, he said, oh, if every African would want to have a house and a big car and an air condition, you know, the planet would boil over. I mean, these are oligarchs, you know, and it doesn't matter what is the color of their skin. You have oligarchs in all shades and forms, and they belong to a class of people who enjoy to have the majority of the people removed. You know, I mean, they like to have their big mansions in a nature park in Africa, you know, where a few people are around from Africa and they are the service people, but they sit in their big villas and they have their big yachts. I mean, have you seen the number of yachts which have in the recent period developed? They have gigantic yachts. A yacht costs maybe $300 million or something. I don't know, probably a little bit too much, but enormous amounts. They have billionaires now, 2-digit billionaires. For what? You know, they have a lifestyle. They fly with their airplanes or helicopters from private airstrips to private airstrips. It's insane. And 1.7 billion people of the world are in immediate danger of starvation. 2 billion have no clean water. I think this injustice, this increase of the gap between the filthily stinking rich and the billions who don't have enough to eat, that has to be stopped. That is perverse. And that will not last, because I cannot imagine that, you know, that this system can survive. Either the governments do something to increase the taxes on these people. You know, you could remedy that. They can have a couple of million. I don't care. I don't want them to be impoverished, but they should be prevented from having this effect on the general society.
Okay, Kirk?
Yes, I'm going to pick up on that point that Helga just now made. Many people, I think, might be surprised to hear my suggestion on how to handle extreme wealth. And to answer the question of the person who wrote the question about the military industrial complex, is it simply profiteering, or is it more about oligarchies and power? Well, I think it's both, but it's definitely both. It's not one or the other. Just to put that one to bed. The world is rife right now with me people. Me meaning I'm important. Me am the important factor in my life. Until we change that to look outward to others and people who are benevolent and share in the belief that it is important that we help others. Until we change that group of people, we're going to continue to stumble and bumble along the way. We need decency and honesty and integrity, something I mentioned earlier. But The point is this. Here's what I propose, at least for the United States, but I think it could be, the principle could be applied anywhere. But I'll talk in terms of US dollars. If you make $5 million or more than 5 million, you are not allowed to keep the money. You're not allowed. You can make it. You can even choose where it goes against a list of public needs or maybe international needs. You can think of it as a charity donation to the planet, to the nation, to whatever, science, engineering, pick it. There will be a list that you could of maybe 300 to 500 things that we could all think of that would be good to open up for public donation. So you don't lose the money. You don't give it to the government because we can't guarantee the government has a halo over its head. I haven't seen many politicians with halos lately. So I would have rich people give anything above 5 million to a public need, in other words. And because they're probably reasonably smart people, if they accrued all of this money, maybe not everyone, but a lot of them are smart, they would probably invest it or give it to or grant it to good, noble causes on that list of 200 or 300 things or 500, whatever it is. Anyway, I do not agree with this current practice where you can be a multi-billionaire. It's ludicrous, it's ridiculous, and I agree with Helga 100%.
Okay, Diane?
I'm really happy to hear you say that, Kirk. Yeah, I on that question, I agree. I was actually thinking a little differently of a marginal tax, which means it would go to the government. And I had been, maybe it's inflation, I was thinking would be something like $22 million in a year, because that's what the average health insurance company CEO seems to make while preventing people from being able to pay their medical expenses. But at any rate, we actually have to make the government good. Somehow we have to do that, because the problem is if we don't do that, then somehow whoever has the most money is going to be ending up making the decisions. And part of that question really does go to this question of electoral integrity, but also it goes to what people are doing in the streets. I think it's very important that all these farmers are out demonstrating, and other groups of people have been out demonstrating. I think, in a sense, our job is to help to inform the demands of these groups, because we're at a point where we don't just want to say no. I mean, that's okay. People all hate hyperinflation. We don't like starving to death. There are certain things that we think are terrible, but can we rally the people who are in motion actually for a program that's necessary for this conception of a new Bretton Woods, to have an idea of that? And I think one of the very real problems we have is it's been so many decades since you've actually had a functional government in the West that defends the principle of the general welfare. It's very difficult for people here to imagine a government doing that.
Okay, so we've got a few other questions, and then we're going to ask for some summaries. It's good. I mean, there's a lot of other questions coming in, but there's a question for you, Diane, which is asked from PETA, which is, what can U.S. legislative institutions do to prevent a Western rearmament process after Russia, quote, ostracizes the collective West from the Ukrainian peace process? Now, that's all said ironically, the last part. But the main point is, what can be done by U.S. legislative institutions to prevent a rearmament?
Should I go ahead with that now?
Yeah.
I mean, I think we saw the inverse. You know, Biden went to the Congress and asked for $33 billion. And instead of telling him, get out of here, this is stupid, we should send nothing, they said, oh, we'll give you $40 billion. So one way is that the legislative bodies, the House and then the Senate, can determine what money goes where, or can demand funding go to things that actually are productive as opposed to not. I think the people have to play a really important role. When you have someone in the Congress who has the guts to stand up against this insane anti-Russia narrative, like Congressman Massey and recently Marjorie Taylor Greene was very clear that we're heading toward nuclear war, people should really back them up. And that means not just calling them, but calling up your own representative and say, hey, what's the matter with you? Why aren't you working with this person? Finally, someone who has a little courage. I think the American people underestimate how much it actually does make a difference for you to reach out, call that congressman's office, go to their office locally. I guess, part of the effects of all of this hoopla is you can't freely walk around in Washington or go to your representative's office there, but you can do it locally, and we urgently have to. There's a lot that the legislature can do to rein in an out of control military-industrial complex.
By the way, before I go to you, I think, Kirk, you had your hand up. You wanted to say something. Is that right?
Diane covered it.
Okay, great. So very good.
Very well.
And all right. So there was another question in your direction, Diane. Let me give you this one, and then there's some questions for everybody. So this one is from Robert. Robert's from Lynchburg, Virginia. He says, maybe we can get rid of Joe Biden like Cuomo. He is not up for re-election in 2022, as many people seem to think. Can we live with him until 2024? Because I think the question here about elections, their role, and other matters might be, okay?
Yeah, well, we definitely don't want something like what was done to Cuomo. I mean, look what we got. Governor Hochul, disaster, shutting down nuclear plants and then shutting down the gas-powered plants. We're going to freeze and starve in the dark. So you really need due process. And again, it gets to the role of the citizenry. I have to say, it's urgent that you demand transparent elections. If there's an election where people have reason to doubt the result, whether you like it or not, I think most Americans, if they were sure that it were a fair election and they didn't like the result, they would say, okay, I guess I did a bad job organizing for what I needed. But if anybody has any doubt, if you can't prove that an election was fair, then you really have a problem, because you're going to have someone in office who has no mandate, which in the case of someone who's bad might be a good thing, but it's really not a good thing to not be able to trust your government or to trust the process. The other thing is we have to demand leaders of a higher quality. I can say, as a quote unquote third party candidate, this question comes up, well, aren't you splitting the vote? Well, we have the incumbent Schumer, and we have a pact by the Republican Party never to run anything or anyone serious against him. So what am I splitting the vote from? Why don't people demand that you get candidates who actually represent what the nation needs, and instead of being pragmatic and talking about it like a football game, organize? And I think the situation is ripe. I mean, I really think we're in a moment where people are searching for those heavy ideas. They don't want sound bites. They should be learning that they're not going to get answers in single issue questions, that they have to think a little bit profoundly. It's taken many years to get into the mess that we're in. We can turn the direction immediately, but it's going to take us probably a few generations to get out of this mess. And therefore, you should be looking for people who are serious and not like someone who resembles your popular next door neighbor.
Okay, I think we've got 3 questions more that we're going to take. This one is for Diane and Helga. This is from Alvin, and he says the following. The combination of effects between 2+ years of COVID, including isolation, shutdown, the increased growing financial pressure on parents and families, the drug of cell phone usage, the dilapidated structural state of things is having a dehumanizing effect on our young people. A 13-year-old that I have contact with is an otherwise bright and vibrant kid, has expressed thoughts of harming himself. I'm intervening by referring him to a younger member of ours for trying to uplift his state of mind. But here's where we have to look at how to expand and grow past this point. And he's basically reporting that and then seeing if there's any comment that either of you have. So Helga, why don't I go to you first?
It is a big problem. It's also in Europe, not only in the United States. I mean, you have the suicide rate going up. People have depressions. There are by far not enough places for psychological treatment for especially young people. So this is a huge problem. I mean, we have a breakdown of labor force and lack of psychological treatment is just one element everywhere, you know, and that has a lot to do with the fact that, you know, attention has not been put for, in the case of Germany, 40 years of knowing that we would have a demographic problem. And now you have a complete lack of everything, including cheap labor jobs. So naturally, a young person growing up in such an environment, it's not conducive to have a bright future. If you are being told all the time that the next generations will be so much worse off than the previous ones, I mean, what do you expect? You have the future of wars. You have the future of it's just a terrible world for young people to grow up into. So I think, you know, we have tried this with the Committee of Coincidence of Opposites with some success, not enough, but some success, where based on the idea of Franklin D. Roosevelt to have a CCC youth training program. I mean, the best way, apart from those children youth who need professional help, which is a large number, but for the normal average kids in trouble, you have to give them a mission. You know, I mean, there's so many things, you know, like building up agriculture in the developing countries, building up health systems in poor areas in the US and Europe, but also, in Africa and Asia, Latin America. I mean, there's so many things that if you give people an important job to do, and you provide for the means to actually accomplish it, you can get people optimistic. I mean, it's the lack of a perspective what people should do with their life, which has this terrible result. And naturally, I mean, in every culture, you have these pearls. You have, you know, in the American culture, you have Edgar Allan Poe. You have, you know, great painters, American painters. You have so many beautiful things which have to be revived. In Germany, obviously, we have an enormous wealth of poets, of composers, of thinkers. All of that is not being brought to the young people because of stupidity and because of oligarchical control. They like to go to big festivals themselves, but they make the prices of these things so expensive that normal families can't afford it. So we need all of these things can be dealt with, and we basically know what to do, but we need a larger army. So I'm calling upon all of you to join us, because we are in revolutionary times like nobody has ever seen in our lifetime, for sure. So join us, we can do it.
Okay, Diane?
It's hard to follow that. I agree. I will say one thing. In terms of getting out of this crisis, I think we have to talk to the teachers because they are very demoralized by the lack of recognition of the damage that's been done to the young people. That is the same sane teachers, many of them older and more experienced and not in there just to administer tests or something. But I know we discussed last year, many of them are saying that because of the lockdowns and isolation, the children are coming back to school and they are 1 or 2 years behind. And we are mandated by law to teach them a certain curriculum which they can't possibly understand. Now imagine if you're already depressed, and I know in one county on Long Island where they actually kept a study, the rate of suicides among children under the age of 18 has tripled. So imagine if you're already depressed and you come back and in your classroom, you're being presented with material that you absolutely are not prepared to handle. So there has to be a discussion among the people dealing with this. How do we address this? And beyond that, I think if Helga's health CCC had been implemented in the middle of the pandemic, we'd be in a totally different place. If instead of throwing everyone's hands up and saying, there's nothing you can do, we had entrusted younger people to take care of very important functions, whether it was building larger classrooms or improving ventilation or delivering food to senior citizens or picking up the garbage or whatever it is. I mean, there were all kinds of things that could have been done. I know of one program run in part out of a church or a group of churches in Buffalo where they set up a phone bank and they actually reached, I forget, I think 400,000 people. Maybe it was 100 or 200,000 households, but 400,000 people by phone with a questionnaire also screening for mental depression and do you need food, and probably talking to people that at the height of the pandemic, maybe it wasn't the best thing to go to that wedding or whatever it was they were planning. They cut the COVID rate by something like 40%. And I'm sure the people involved in that program had a very happy sense that they were actually engaged in doing something that made a difference. And I think that is one of the most moralizing things for a human being to be engaged in, is to know that you are contributing something for the good of mankind. You're doing something which is going to live on after your short mortal existence. There is really nothing, in a sense, more fulfilling or inspiring of happiness than doing that. And one of the ways we have robbed these young people is we've robbed them from participating in that kind of pleasure.
So while we have many other questions, what I'm going to do is simply acknowledge some of them and propose that members of the Schiller Institute can respond in kind. There was a question from Corky. Does the panel see some form of cold fusion as among our future energy solutions? I think we can refer that to Jason. There's a question from Christian. How would a massive transportation project in the U.S. affect the motor industry? I feel there would be massive opposition. I'm thinking of one particular member, Richard Freeman, who could respond to that. And there's other such questions. I just want to indicate these. For example, there's also an important question here, which is how come Native Americans aren't mentioned in the Declaration of Independence? I would be happy to respond to that question. But we're not going to do that here now because we're going to begin the process of coming to a conclusion of today's event. Let me just also point out that the purpose of it was and is that the resolution that you know we're circulating, we'll have it up on the screen again at the conclusion, be circulated and be signed. I know that Kirk Wiebe, for example, is a proud signer of that resolution. And what I'm going to do now is pose a final question for the panel, which will also give everybody on the panel a way of giving final remarks. So here's what the question is. This is from Kynan, and he thanks Helga and Diane. He says, you have both given very beautiful speeches. Helga referenced a quote from John Quincy Adams in which he rejected the idea of the United States becoming an empire seeking monsters to destroy. As we approach the 250th anniversary of that declaration, which will be in 2026, how can we approach Americans whose lives are getting worse and worse from the breakdown of the transatlantic financial system, to recognize this idea of the Declaration as being international, as the founding fathers originally intended, rather than confined to one specific nation. Many people in the United States are certainly concerned about their own lives, but seem to neglect that of others in the world. I think I'm going to go to you first, Diane, and then to Kirk, and then to Helga.
That's interesting. I think, well, and I know the questioner Kynan has been part of this process of poetry, and I think some of these things really can be taken up best in that domain. And why do people love poetry? Why do you find it beautiful? It's a means of addressing a conception which is true, such a high truth that you can't, the words will make it untrue, just as things that exist in the flesh cannot attain the perfection of something in the ideal. And I think there needs to be a much greater emphasis on this in our society and culture as a whole. And to that end, I was really delighted by what Helga presented us in what she did at the beginning of this. And it's worth reflecting for Americans on this 4th of July, how Abraham Lincoln spoke, or how some of our great American leaders have spoken, or Martin Luther King. These people really were poets. And as they spoke in poetic terms, they were able to reach something inside people of a universal quality, which caused people to be much better than they would have been otherwise. And I think this is what we have to do really right now in recruiting people like crazy rapidly to this organization and to this mission from every imaginable walk of life and every imaginable place where people think they have differences.
Okay, very good. Kirk?
Yes, sir. Well, I would say to Kynan, and it's a very thoughtful question, I think, and a good one. How do we internationalize the principles outlined by or contained in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution? Well, there's probably two ways to do that strike me off the top of my head. Number one, outwardly outline the history of the principles contained in those documents. We can go back to biblical times. We can go back to Babylon. We can go to Hammurabi. We can come forward to the Magna Carta and there's a whole evolution of law on the one hand, and you might say the 10 Commandments. And we have an evolution of human rights that kind of parallels and crosses into the law over a couple of millennia. And so I think we need to teach that to others, ourselves, because I think it's forgotten or not paid attention to. And the other thing we need to do, and I think it would be a thoughtful study, is look at some of the other major cultures globally that maybe did not participate in the evolution of what ultimately derives the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, but find comparative points of view in other cultures, how rights are viewed. Now, that would be a real mixed bag because we know there are some very patriarchal cultures in the world, and women won't be happy about that, but there are. And so I think a good compare and contrast kind of study would be good for that, Dennis.
Okay, interesting. Okay, Helga?
My answer to Kynan is that, the best way to internationalize that is to spread the Schiller Institute. Because, when I looked for a charter to be the basis of the Schiller Institute, I looked at the UN Charter, I looked at various declarations, and I came to the conclusion that the Declaration of Independence was the most powerful of all. And, it's not coincidence that it is a coincidence. Well, it's not an accident, I wanted to say, that it is exactly like the Rüttli Oath of Wilhelm Tell. As a matter of fact, if you compare the Rüttli Oath and the Declaration of Independence, it is very clear that Schiller was absolutely inspired by the Declaration of Independence. So I decided I would change just a few words, where it says the British masters, or some formulation like that. I say the international financial institutions who are suppressing the developing countries. So I just made tiny changes, and it does fit all countries right now. So make the Schiller Institute grow in all the countries. I'm right now very optimistic that that is what is happening right now, because our ideas are resonating everywhere, and we have to build this institution as a real resistance front of those people who don't have a voice. So if you think about that, I think that is the best way of doing it. Otherwise, I also think what Kirk said, what you said, is absolutely true. We have done a lot with the dialogue of cultures, and I have always emphasized that it has to be a dialogue of the best traditions of all cultures. And, I have looked at this quite a bit. You have so many parallels to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, maybe not the specific form, but in terms of the values, decency, honesty, respect for the others. You have lots of that. I wrote several articles and I made several speeches about that. So that is relatively easy. And I have made the experience that other peoples are very responsive when you approach them that way, because, in Germany we have a proverb which says, it yells out of the woods, or it echoes out of the woods as you yell into it. If you treat people with respect and you show interest for the best of what they have produced, they will respond to that in the same way, and you can build a beautiful world. On the other side, if I approach the other person and say, "Oh, you have such an ugly nose, and your ears are really standing out like sails," you can make an enemy out of anybody. It is really the question: what is your intention to the other person, and do you want to make that other person a better person, a more creative person? And then you will find that the response is in almost all cases, unless you have a hardcore oligarch, it is a positive. And I would just like to end with one other thought. I mean, look, when Lyndon LaRouche prognosed that all of this would happen in 1971, he made himself the arch enemy of that powers to be who are responsible for this crisis. And I have said many times, especially when the prosecution against him happened and when he was innocently in jail and when we had the very important tribunal in 95, I said the real crime, what was done to my late husband, was not that he was put in jail. Even that was terrible and should never have happened. But the real crime was it deprived the Americans, but also many other people in the world, from having access to his ideas. If that would not have happened, we would not be in this crisis right now. And the best thing you can do, study the wise words of Lyndon LaRouche, because you have all the knowledge which you need right now in his writings. My advice to you, and do it quickly, get in touch with us. We help you. We set up classes. We help you to really become an independent, sovereign person who could be like Diane. You could be running for Congress, for Senate, for president, but you have to qualify yourself. And the best way to do it is with studying of the works of Lyndon LaRouche.
Very well said. That was awesome. I want to thank you all for tuning in to this Schiller Institute live stream. So everyone enjoy your holiday weekend and take care. Thank you so much. This is CJ, and we're over and out.